It started with a single missing name printed in black ink inside the most important royal document of the decade. Courtiers noticed it first, then broadcasters. Then senior guests arriving at Westminster Abbey began whispering among themselves. Prince Harry's name, once expected to appear beside the working members of the monarchy during the coronation proceedings, had quietly vanished. And according to palace insiders, it was not an accident. What Lady Louise allegedly discovered behind palace walls would soon expose a devastating truth the royal family had tried desperately to contain. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The coronation program had been treated like a sacred artifact long before the public ever saw it. Distributed quietly to senior royal households, foreign dignitaries, trusted officials, and select members of the British establishment, every line inside it carried meaning. Every placement mattered. This was not merely paper and ink, it was hierarchy, symbolism, legacy. And according to reports circulating among palace administrative circles, Prince Harry's placement inside that program had been altered repeatedly in the final weeks before King Charles III's coronation. Different interpretations of the revisions suggest tensions had reached a level far more serious than the palace was prepared to admit publicly. Some insiders whisper that aides were instructed to avoid discussing the Sussex issue entirely during official planning meetings, while others claim senior staff became visibly nervous whenever Harry's attendance was mentioned. What should have been a historic celebration of continuity had quietly transformed into an unforgiving internal struggle over trust, loyalty, and the future shape of the monarchy itself. As the days moved closer to the coronation, the atmosphere behind palace walls reportedly became colder and more calculated. Courtiers, who had spent decades navigating royal crises, allegedly described the environment as unusually tense. It was no longer simply about ceremonial arrangements or public optics. Something deeper had fractured. Royal commentators now point toward Harry's increasingly isolated presence throughout the coronation weekend, as evidence that the divide inside the family had already become institutional long before the cameras arrived. Observers noticed the distance, the silence, the absence of the easy familiarity that once existed between the Duke of Sussex and senior royals. Reports suggest that even routine interactions were being carefully managed to avoid unexpected confrontations. And palace insiders claim conversations surrounding Harry often ended in exhaustion rather than resolution. But the moment that allegedly changed everything did not happen in public. It happened privately, away from the official processions and rehearsals, during one of several tense internal meetings involving senior advisors close to the king. According to various interpretations of palace movements during that period, Lady Louise unexpectedly became aware of fragments of a deeply sensitive discussion that senior royals believed would never leave the room. Sources familiar with Windsor household routines claim voices could allegedly be heard through partially open corridors as advisors debated what one insider described as an irreversible line. The conversation reportedly centered around damage caused by repeated public disclosures, private grievances becoming global headlines, and growing fears that the monarchy itself was slowly losing control of its own narrative. One palace figure allegedly warned that the institution could survive scandal, criticism, and even humiliation, but it could not survive uncertainty surrounding trust at its highest levels. At the center of it all stood King Charles, torn between public duty and private heartbreak. Reports suggest the king faced enormous internal pressure throughout the coronation preparations, not only from senior advisors but from competing visions of what the monarchy should become after the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. Some pushed for reconciliation. Others reportedly believed the crown had already extended every possible olive branch. The emotional weight of those decisions appeared to grow heavier with every passing day. Different interpretations of Charles's state during that period describe a monarch exhausted by conflict, physically weakened, and emotionally trapped between fatherhood and the brutal demands of the institution he had spent his entire life preparing to lead. Palace insiders now claim that every adjustment to the coronation program reflected those tensions in real time. Nothing was random, nothing accidental. And when the final version emerged, the message embedded within it appeared unmistakable to those who understood royal symbolism. Harry had not been erased entirely, but the positioning itself reportedly reflected a monarchy creating distance with surgical precision. Royal commentators began openly questioning why the Duke seemed increasingly disconnected throughout the ceremonies, while others noted that senior members of the family appeared focused on projecting unity without fully embracing reconciliation. To the outside world, the coronation still carried all the grandeur and sacred tradition expected of the British monarchy. But beneath that carefully controlled image, insiders whisper that a painful transformation had already taken place. The institution had begun prioritizing survival over sentiment, continuity over emotion, and duty over blood. And according to those familiar with the private tensions surrounding the program revisions, Lady Louise's alleged discovery exposed the painful reality at the heart of the crisis. The palace no longer feared scandal nearly as much as it feared betrayal. But the missing name was only the surface of a far deeper conflict, one tied to betrayal, trust, and a private decision made long before the Abbey bells rang. Behind the gold-trimmed doors of Buckingham Palace, preparations for the coronation were reportedly turning toxic. Meetings stretched late into the night. Seating charts were rewritten. Security arrangements shifted without explanation. And according to various interpretations of those chaotic weeks, the real crisis was not logistics, it was Prince Harry himself. Palace insiders now whisper that every conversation eventually circled back to one question. Could the monarchy trust him enough to place him visibly inside its most sacred ceremony? What began as quiet concern inside royal circles had reportedly evolved into something far more severe by the final months before the coronation. According to palace administrative streams ranging from security staff to ceremonial advisors, aides feared the private tensions inside the royal family were becoming impossible to contain. The coronation was supposed to symbolize continuity, stability, and unity after years of turbulence surrounding the monarchy. Instead, insiders claim it became overshadowed by a growing fear that any unexpected interaction involving the Duke of Sussex could erupt into another global controversy. The palace, an institution built on control and discipline, allegedly found itself trapped in a constant state of anticipation, unsure whether reconciliation was still possible or whether the fractures had already become permanent. Much of that anxiety reportedly stemmed from the damage caused by Harry's memoir and public interviews. While supporters viewed his revelations as personal truth-telling, palace insiders allegedly saw them very differently. According to various interpretations of internal discussions, the issue was no longer simply about criticism or embarrassment. It was about trust. Deep, irreversible trust. Courtiers who had served the monarchy for decades reportedly feared that private royal conversations were no longer safe within the family itself. Every confidential exchange suddenly carried risk. Every emotional moment could potentially become tomorrow's headline. And insiders now whisper that this lingering fear changed the atmosphere surrounding the coronation preparations entirely. What should have been an emotional reunion slowly transformed into a calculated exercise in containment. Prince William, according to reports circulating among senior royal observers, emerged as one of the strongest voices pushing for stricter ceremonial boundaries. Sources familiar with palace planning claim the Prince of Wales believed the institution could not afford further uncertainty during such a historic transition of power. Different interpretations suggest William's position was shaped not only by anger, but by a growing determination to protect the monarchy from additional instability. He reportedly pushed for clearer distinctions between working royals and those who had stepped away from official duties. Behind closed doors, advisors allegedly debated everything from seating arrangements to camera positioning, all designed to prevent the coronation from becoming overshadowed by personal drama. Palace insiders now claim those decisions were not made out of cruelty, but out of fear that the institution itself was beginning to lose control of its own narrative. Amid this growing tension, Lady Louise reportedly became an increasingly respected presence during private family gatherings. Known for her quiet loyalty to the traditions cherished by the late Queen Elizabeth II, She was often viewed as one of the younger royals most deeply connected to the old values of duty, discretion, and restraint. Sources close to royal household circles suggest her presence during several informal gatherings placed her unusually close to conversations that senior advisors believed would remain hidden from public view, while she remained largely outside media attention. Insiders claim she quietly observed the emotional toll these tensions were taking on the family, especially on King Charles himself. And at the center of everything stood the king, caught between fatherhood and the crushing pressure of the crown. Reports suggest Charles struggled privately with the growing demands from palace officials urging stronger boundaries around the Sussexes during coronation events. Some insiders describe a monarch emotionally exhausted by years of conflict, desperate to preserve both his family and the institution he had waited a lifetime to inherit. But according to various palace interpretations, the deeper the preparations went, the more impossible those two goals became to balance. Administrative teams reportedly developed what some insiders described as containment strategies surrounding Sussex appearances, carefully managing movements, interactions, and ceremonial visibility to minimize risk during the historic weekend. By that point, the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace allegedly no longer felt celebratory. It felt defensive, controlled, fragile. And as tensions quietly escalated behind palace walls, one private conversation involving Lady Louise would allegedly reveal the real reason the program changed forever. It was never supposed to leave the room. According to insiders familiar with Windsor household movements, Lady Louise allegedly encountered fragments of a conversation that senior royals believed would remain buried forever. Voices were raised. One aide reportedly described the situation as untenable. Another warned that the monarchy could not survive another public humiliation. And somewhere in the middle of that exchange came the chilling sentence that changed everything. Harry could no longer be treated as trusted inside the institution. The atmosphere inside Windsor during those final coronation preparations had reportedly become suffocating. Conversations that once revolved around ceremonial, tradition, and national celebration were now dominated by fear, uncertainty, and quiet resentment. According to various palace interpretations, the institution itself had entered survival mode. Senior aides allegedly moved through corridors with unusual urgency, while private meetings stretched deeper into the night with every passing week. What had begun as concern over headlines and public reaction slowly evolved into something far more personal. The palace was no longer simply responding to controversy. It was responding to betrayal, or at least what many inside the institution had allegedly come to view as betrayal after years of interviews, documentaries, memoirs, and deeply public family grievances. Reports suggest Lady Louise became unintentionally exposed to one of the most emotionally charged discussions of the entire coronation period. Sources familiar with Windsor household routines claim she allegedly overheard fragments of a tense exchange involving senior advisors, members of the royal inner circle, while preparations intensified behind closed doors. Different interpretations of the moment vary in detail, but nearly all versions point toward the same devastating theme. Protecting the monarchy had now become more important than protecting feelings. One palace figure reportedly argued that the institution must survive beyond individual relationships, while another allegedly warned that every unresolved conflict surrounding Prince Harry carried the potential to overshadow King Charles's historic moment forever. The discussion was no longer framed as a family disagreement. It had become a constitutional risk in the eyes of those tasked with protecting the crown. Concerns surrounding leaks and public trust reportedly dominated much of the exchange. According to insiders, the emotional wounds caused by Harry's memoir and repeated interviews had left deep scars inside palace operations. Courtiers who once believed disagreements could remain private allegedly became consumed by fear that any conversation, disagreement, or emotional confrontation might someday reappear on television screens or inside another international headline. Palace administrative streams now claim trust had eroded so severely that even routine planning discussions surrounding the coronation were handled with unusual caution. Some insiders whisper that sensitive conversations were deliberately limited to only the smallest inner circles, while others suggest advisors became obsessed with minimizing unpredictable situations during the historic ceremony itself. At the center of those tensions stood King Charles, reportedly carrying the emotional burden of both father and monarch at the same time. Sources close to palace operations claim the king appeared visibly exhausted during several key meetings surrounding coronation planning. Different interpretations describe a man emotionally worn down by years of family conflict, deeply aware that every decision involving Harry would be scrutinized not only by the public, but by history itself. Insiders suggest Charles repeatedly struggled with the painful reality that any effort toward reconciliation now risked destabilizing the carefully managed image of unity the monarchy desperately needed during the transition of reign. The crown demanded control. The father inside him reportedly wanted peace. And somewhere between those two impossible responsibilities, the emotional strain allegedly became overwhelming. It was during these private discussions, according to royal insiders, that attention allegedly turned toward reducing Harry's symbolic role inside official coronation materials. Sources claim advisors debated how visible the Duke of Sussex should appear within the ceremony without allowing the event itself to become consumed by controversy. Every detail suddenly carried enormous weight: placement, titles, public positioning. Even the smallest adjustment reportedly reflected larger institutional calculations unfolding behind closed doors. And when the final coronation program eventually emerged with Harry's position noticeably diminished, insiders would later connect it directly back to these emotionally charged conversations inside Windsor. What appeared subtle to the public allegedly represented something far more serious within palace walls: a carefully measured distancing designed to protect the monarchy from further instability during one of the most vulnerable periods in modern royal history. But removing a name from a program was not simply about appearances, it was part of a much larger strategy unfolding inside the monarchy itself. By the final weeks before the coronation, the palace machine had reportedly entered full defensive mode. Courtiers moved with military precision. Invitations were scrutinized. Seating positions were recalculated down to inches. According to those familiar with the planning process, an invisible line had been drawn between the working monarchy and the Sussexes, and once that line appeared, there would be no turning back. The removal from the program was not emotional. It was institutional. Inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere surrounding the coronation allegedly shifted from celebration to strategy with astonishing speed. What had once been framed publicly as a historic moment of unity reportedly became dominated by discussions about control, optics, and institutional survival. Palace insiders now whisper that senior aides approached the ceremony less like a royal celebration and more like a high-risk operation where every detail had to be carefully managed to avoid disaster. Reports suggest strict visibility protocols were quietly introduced for non-working royals, particularly surrounding appearances, positioning, and ceremonial prominence. Nothing was left to chance. Every entrance, every photograph, every seating arrangement reportedly passed through multiple layers of review as advisors attempted to protect the crown from becoming overshadowed by unresolved family tensions. At the center of those calculations stood Prince Harry, whose ceremonial role allegedly became one of the most debated issues of the entire coronation planning process. Different interpretations from palace administrative circles claim the concern was not simply about protocol, but about symbolism. The monarchy, after years of public conflict, could no longer risk sending mixed messages about who represented the institution and who stood outside it. Sources familiar with internal discussions suggest some advisors feared that placing Harry too prominently inside the ceremony would blur the boundaries the palace had spent years trying to establish after the Sussexes stepped away from royal duties. Others reportedly argued that reducing his visibility too drastically could trigger even more public controversy. It became an impossible balancing act, and according to insiders, every compromise only deepened the emotional strain already tearing through the family behind closed doors. Prince William reportedly emerged as one of the strongest supporters of what palace figures allegedly described as a future-focused monarchy strategy. Sources close to royal operations claim the Prince of Wales believed the institution had entered a dangerous period where stability depended on discipline, clarity, and controlled messaging. Different interpretations suggest William viewed the coronation not merely as a ceremonial event, but as the foundation for the monarchy's next era after years of crisis and public division. Palace insiders whisper that he pushed for a streamlined royal image centered firmly around working members of the family who remained committed to official duty. In that vision, emotional reconciliation could no longer come at the expense of institutional stability. To some within royal circles, it was cold. To others, it was necessary survival. Amid these growing tensions, Lady Louise reportedly became viewed internally as part of the monarchy's stable younger generation. Unlike the turbulence consuming the Sussex narrative, Louise's quiet loyalty to royal tradition allegedly earned deep respect among senior figures connected to the late Queen's values. Sources claim her calm presence during family gatherings contrasted sharply with the emotional volatility surrounding the coronation preparations. While she remained far from the center of public attention, insiders suggest her proximity to several key discussions unintentionally exposed her to the deeper institutional anxieties shaping the palace's decisions. And according to various interpretations, what she allegedly overheard helped explain why the final program revisions felt so deliberate rather than accidental. Royal commentators later began pointing toward Harry's visibly isolated positioning during several key coronation events as evidence that these internal strategies had already been fully implemented by the time the world arrived at Westminster Abbey. Observers noticed the distance between him and senior royals. They noticed how carefully interactions appeared managed. Some insiders even claimed certain arrangements were specifically designed to minimize unpredictable moments that could distract from King Charles's historic day. And after weeks of emotionally charged debate, reports suggest Charles himself ultimately approved the final revisions to the program, despite the enormous personal pain surrounding those decisions. Sources close to palace circles describe a monarch exhausted by conflict, but increasingly convinced that preserving the institution required painful compromises that no father would ever willingly make. Yet even after the program was finalized, insiders claimed the emotional fallout inside the family was only beginning to erupt. For King Charles, the coronation was supposed to represent triumph after decades of waiting. Instead, reports suggest it became one of the most emotionally punishing moments of his life. Behind the crown, behind the music, behind the ancient rituals stood a father forced to weigh blood against duty. And according to various palace interpretations, the decisions surrounding Harry's place in the program symbolized something far more devastating than public optics. It marked the moment Charles accepted that the monarchy could no longer bend around personal pain. For most of his life, Charles had waited for this moment. The crown was not simply an achievement waiting at the end of a political career. It was destiny. Obligation. A role shaped by decades of preparation, sacrifice, criticism, and relentless scrutiny beneath the shadow of Queen Elizabeth II's historic reign. Yet insiders now whisper that when the coronation finally arrived, the emotional reality unfolding behind palace walls looked nothing like the triumphant image projected to the world. According to sources close to royal circles, Charles entered the ceremony carrying not only the burden of kingship, but the crushing weight of a family crisis that had spiraled far beyond private disagreement. The crown may have represented continuity for the monarchy, but for Charles personally, it allegedly became a painful reminder of everything that had fractured inside the House of Windsor. Reports suggest the king struggled constantly with balancing family loyalty against the institutional demands of the crown. Different interpretations of palace discussions describe a monarch torn between two impossible responsibilities. On one side stood the father who still loved his son despite years of public conflict. On the other stood the sovereign being warned by advisors that the monarchy itself could not survive appearing indecisive during such a vulnerable transition of reign. Palace insiders claim senior officials repeatedly cautioned Charles against any move that might be interpreted as weakness, especially after 3 years of damaging headlines surrounding the Sussexes. The institution needed stability, discipline, clear boundaries. And according to those familiar with the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace, those warnings grew louder with every passing day. Harry's public criticism of the royal family allegedly intensified fears deep inside palace operations about what might come next. After the memoir, the interviews, and the deeply personal accusations broadcast across the world, insiders reportedly became consumed by a growing sense of uncertainty. Some palace figures allegedly feared that reconciliation efforts could expose a monarchy to even greater instability if private interactions later became public narratives. Trust, according to various royal interpretations, had become dangerously fragile. The fear was no longer only about scandal. It was about unpredictability. About the possibility that every conversation, every disagreement, every emotional exchange might someday be weaponized against the institution itself. And for Charles, that reality reportedly became emotionally devastating because it forced him to confront a truth he never wanted to accept, that protecting the crown might now require creating distance from his own son. Amid all this turmoil, Lady Louise's quiet loyalty reportedly earned enormous respect among senior royals who still held tightly to the traditions established under Queen Elizabeth II. Sources close to royal household circles claim Louise became viewed as a symbol of restraint, dignity, and duty during a period consumed by instability and emotional exhaustion. Unlike the endless media speculation surrounding the Sussexes, Louise remained almost entirely removed from public drama, quietly supporting family traditions without demanding attention or influence. Insiders whisper that her calm presence during coronation preparations stood in sharp contrast to the emotional chaos unfolding elsewhere inside the family. And, according to various interpretations, this only deepened the symbolic divide between the monarchy's future inner circle and those now increasingly viewed as standing outside the institution. As coronation weekend unfolded, the event itself reportedly became framed internally as more than a ceremony. Palace commentators and royal insiders increasingly described it as a symbolic reset for the monarchy after years of crisis, scandal, and division. The program revisions, the carefully managed appearances, the strict ceremonial boundaries, all of it allegedly reflected a larger institutional decision to redefine who represented the crown moving forward. Yet, despite the emotional distance that had formed, reports suggest Charles privately continued hoping the family tensions might someday heal. Sources claim he never fully abandoned the belief that reconciliation remained possible. Even his advisors pushed the monarchy toward a colder, more disciplined future. But by the time the coronation concluded, insiders whisper that something fundamental had already changed forever inside the royal family. But as the dust settled after the coronation, the real shock came from how the royal family moved forward afterward, with a silence louder than any public statement. When the cameras finally disappeared and the coronation weekend came to an end, something inside the monarchy had fundamentally changed. The old structure, the one that once protected Harry no matter the controversy, appeared gone. In its place stood a colder, more disciplined institution shaped by survival. And according to royal insiders, Lady Louise's alleged discovery exposed a truth the palace no longer felt able to hide. The crown had chosen continuity over reconciliation. In the days that followed the coronation, the silence surrounding the royal family reportedly became impossible to ignore. There were no dramatic announcements, no emotional public reconciliations, no visible attempts to erase the tension the world had witnessed lingering beneath the surface of the ceremony. Instead, according to palace observers, there was distance. Calculated distance. The kind that speaks louder than confrontation ever could. Royal insiders now whisper that the coronation did not heal the fractures inside the House of Windsor as many had hoped. It formalized them. What had once been treated as temporary family conflict allegedly evolved into something far more permanent after the program revisions and carefully managed appearances surrounding the king's historic weekend. The institution, according to various interpretations, had quietly redrawn its boundaries. Reports suggest Harry's reduced visibility throughout the coronation reflected more than short-term optics. Palace administrative streams now describe it as part of a broader institutional shift already, unfolding behind closed doors long before Westminster Abbey filled with dignitaries and world leaders. The monarchy, shaped by years of scandal, public criticism, and internal instability, reportedly entered a new phase centered on discipline, predictability, and survival. Some insiders claim senior officials no longer viewed emotional reconciliation as the crown's primary objective. The priority had allegedly become preserving continuity during one of the most fragile periods in modern royal history. And according to royal commentators, the program itself became symbolic of that transformation. Every placement, every omission, every calculated adjustment reflected an institution trying to regain control after years of public turbulence. At the same time, Lady Louise increasingly emerged inside royal circles as a quiet symbol of stability and duty. Sources close to palace operations claim senior royals developed enormous respect for her calm loyalty during a period when the monarchy desperately needed younger figures connected to the traditions established by Queen Elizabeth II. Unlike the chaos surrounding the Sussex narrative, Louise represented restraint, discretion, and continuity. She did not seek headlines. She did not publicly challenge the institution. And according to insiders familiar with family dynamics, her presence during several emotionally difficult moments surrounding the coronation only strengthened the perception that the monarchy's future would increasingly depend on figures willing to place duty above personal grievance. In many ways, palace observers claim she became a reflection of the values the institution now believed it needed to survive. Meanwhile, reports suggest Prince William's influence inside palace operations expanded significantly after the coronation. Different interpretations from royal insiders describe a future king increasingly determined to shape a monarchy built around smaller, more controlled structures where loyalty and public discipline mattered more than bloodline alone. Sources claim William viewed the events surrounding the coronation as proof that unresolved internal conflict could no longer be allowed to dominate the institution's public image. Palace commentators now whisper that the Prince of Wales emerged from the coronation period with stronger influence over the monarchy's long-term direction, particularly regarding how future royal roles and visibility would be managed moving forward. And according to those familiar with palace strategy, that influence allegedly signaled a colder but more focused era beginning to take shape behind the scenes. For King Charles, however, the emotional burden reportedly never disappeared. Despite the institutional decisions made during the coronation period, insiders claim the king continued struggling privately with the painful divide separating his role as sovereign from his role as father. Different interpretations suggest Charles still hoped that time might someday soften the hostility consuming the family. Yet the monarchy around him had already begun hardening into something more defensive and cautious after years of turmoil. Royal observers now argue the Sussex divide appears more deeply entrenched than ever before, with trust allegedly fractured on a level that may take generations to repair. And as palace silence replaced public confrontation, the absence of visible reconciliation became its own powerful statement. And in the end, the missing name inside that program revealed far more than a royal scheduling change. It exposed the painful reality that inside the House of Windsor, duty will always come before blood. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.